The morning air was crisp, touched with the faint scent of freshly cut grass that clung to the open field behind the sprawling high school campus. Rows of folding chairs had been arranged in perfect symmetry, stretching across the green expanse, each one draped with a thin program booklet bearing the words Class of the Year in gold lettering. Beyond the chairs, a wide stage had been erected, its navy blue curtains swaying gently in the breeze, and a large banner, stretched high above the platform, bore the promise of new beginnings for the students who would walk across it that day. Among the sea of proud parents and family members taking their seats, a man stood out, not because he sought attention, but because of the quiet authority in his presence. Marcus Hill, a decorated Marine who had spent decades in service to his country, moved with the steadiness of someone who understood both discipline and dignity. His broad shoulders carried the weight of countless missions, yet his sharp eyes carried a softness that only came when a father was about to witness one of the proudest moments of his life. Today was about his son. He wore a pressed navy blazer over a crisp white shirt, paired with dark slacks. His polished shoes reflected the morning light as he walked to his seat, nodding politely at a few strangers along the way. In his hand, he clutched a small leather-bound notebook where he had written a few words for his son, a tradition he had kept for every milestone. There had been birthdays, first days of school, and now graduation day. The words inside were meant to be read later, in private, but just holding the notebook grounded him in the significance of this moment. Around him, the atmosphere buzzed with anticipation. Families snapped photos, adjusting caps and gowns, children fidgeted in their seats, and the school's marching band rehearsed faintly in the distance. Laughter and chatter filled the air, punctuated by the occasional crackle from the speakers as technicians made last-minute sound checks. Everything seemed perfectly aligned for a morning of joy. Yet, as Marcus sat down near the middle section, he noticed the subtle shift in body language from a few people around him. It was nothing overt, just the way certain heads turned and eyes lingered. He was used to it, being a tall, muscular black man in predominantly white suburban settings often brought silent judgments. Over the years, he had learned to push through them, focusing instead on his purpose for being there. Today, that purpose was unshakable. The seats around him slowly filled, but the tension in the air began to change. Two uniformed security guards emerged from the side of the field. Their presence was normal at school events, but Marcus immediately sensed that their attention was not on the crowd as a whole. One of them, a tall man with a square jaw and mirrored sunglasses, scanned the rows until his gaze landed directly on Marcus. His partner, shorter but equally rigid in demeanor, followed suit. They walked toward him with an air of certainty, their heavy boots pressing into the grass with deliberate force. The noise of the crowd seemed to fade slightly in Marcus's ears, replaced by the rhythmic thud of their approach. Years of military training had taught him to read intent before words were even spoken, and he could already tell from their posture that this was not going to be a casual conversation. Without hesitation, the taller guard gestured toward Marcus, making a subtle but unmistakable motion that suggested he should stand. The other guard positioned himself just slightly to the side, blocking part of the aisle. Marcus didn't move at first. He simply looked at them, calm but unyielding. Whatever their reason, this was not the time or place for hostility. Yet he could feel the weight of eyes on him now, people shifting in their chairs, sensing an unusual disruption in what should have been a smooth, celebratory morning. One of the guards leaned forward slightly, his hand resting near the radio on his shoulder. The other crossed his arms, scanning Marcus from head to toe, as if sizing him up. They were speaking, but the words were drowned out by the sound of the marching band striking up their warm-up tune again. Still, Marcus could piece together the intent. They wanted him to leave. The request was absurd. He had been invited, he had a ticket, and his son was graduating. Yet here he was, being treated as though he were a problem to be removed before the ceremony could begin. A tightness settled in his chest, not of fear, but of controlled anger. Years in the Marines had taught him to master his emotions, to respond with clarity, not impulse. But it didn't stop the sting of injustice from cutting deep. The crowd, sensing the growing tension, began to whisper. Parents leaned toward one another, speculating in hushed tones. Some simply watched, waiting to see what would happen next. The graduation announcer's voice crackled over the loudspeaker, calling for guests to take their seats. But the unfolding scene seemed to anchor all attention to one spot. The middle section, where Marcus now stood at the center of a quietly building storm. This was supposed to be a day about pride, legacy, and family. Yet, within minutes, it had become something else entirely. And as the first notes of the processional began to float through the air, the two security guards still stood before him, their expressions unreadable, but their message clear. They weren't going anywhere until he did. It was then, just as the graduates began to appear from the wings of the stage, that the situation shifted in a way no one could have predicted. From the far edge of the seating area, 6 figures began to move, not in a rush, but with a synchronized purpose that drew the eye. Marcus noticed them instantly. He knew the gait, the posture, the unspoken command in their movements. These were not ordinary guests, and as they closed the distance, their presence began to ripple through the crowd like a silent current, hinting that something remarkable was about to unfold. The air was about to change again, this time for good. The 6 men approached with an unhurried but deliberate pace, their eyes fixed on the scene unfolding near the center of the field. They wore civilian clothes, but nothing about their demeanor suggested they were ordinary guests. Their movements were precise, almost military, as if they were unconsciously falling into a formation honed by years of discipline and shared experience. Some of the nearby parents noticed first, their heads turning in curiosity. The murmurs in the crowd grew, a low tide of speculation sweeping across the rows. From a distance, no one knew exactly who these men were, but there was an undeniable air of authority about them, one that made others instinctively shift in their seats, giving them space as they passed. Marcus remained still, his gaze locked on the approaching figures. He didn't need to guess. Even without uniforms, their bearing was unmistakable. He had served long enough to recognize Navy SEALs when he saw them. And not just any. These were men he had known, fought alongside, trusted with his life. The kind of bond that could only be forged in the crucible of war, where loyalty wasn't a choice, but a necessity for survival. The 2 security guards hadn't yet noticed the approaching presence behind them. Their focus was still locked on Marcus, their voices now carrying an edge as they pressed their demand. One gestured toward the edge of the seating area, the other tightened his stance as if bracing for Marcus to resist. But resistance was not necessary. Something far more powerful was coming. The first of the SEALs stepped into view behind the taller guard, his shadow cutting across the grass. The sunlight caught the edge of his square jaw, the deep lines on his face telling stories of battles fought in places most would never see. His eyes, calm yet unyielding, swept over the situation in an instant. The rest of the team fanned out subtly, forming a loose semicircle that framed Marcus in a shield of silent solidarity. The change in atmosphere was immediate. The guards stiffened, their eyes darting briefly to the strangers who had suddenly closed in. Around them, the audience's whispers swelled. People leaned forward in their seats, sensing a confrontation but unsure of its nature. The 6 men didn't need to speak. Their presence was its own statement. Every inch of them radiated the kind of confidence that came from years of being the last line of defense in impossible situations. In the stillness between the music and the ceremony's start, their arrival spoke volumes without a single word. Marcus didn't move. He didn't need to. The weight of the moment was shifting, and everyone could feel it. The guards, once certain in their authority, now found themselves outnumbered, not by force, but by an unspoken code they didn't understand. These men weren't here to create a scene, they were here to end one. One of the seals stepped slightly closer to Marcus, his presence alone anchoring the space. It was a gesture of respect, protection, and quiet defiance all at once. The security guards exchanged a glance, their earlier firmness beginning to falter. The murmurs in the audience grew sharper, some people openly turning in their seats to watch. On stage, the principal adjusted the microphone, unaware of the silent standoff happening just yards away. The graduates, lined up in the wings, peeked from behind the curtains, curious at the crowd's sudden shift in attention. The music played on, but in the middle of the field, a different kind of ceremony was taking place. One where loyalty and brotherhood overshadowed any official program. Marcus could feel the familiar calm that came before decisive action. It wasn't the rush of combat, but the same clarity, knowing exactly who stood with you, and that nothing could move you from your place. The seal's silent stance was all the answer the guards were going to get. For a long moment, no one moved. The breeze carried the faint scent of flowers from nearby arrangements. The sound of a camera shutter clicked somewhere behind them, and the weight of the crowd's stares pressed down on the guards. This was no longer a simple instruction to leave. It was a test of judgment, one they were rapidly failing. The taller guard shifted his weight, his jaw tightening. His partner scanned the group, clearly reassessing their position. The kind of certainty they'd walked in with was now gone, replaced by a growing awareness that they had miscalculated. And in that suspended moment, between the final notes of the processional and the official start of the ceremony, the scene balanced on the edge of something that could either dissolve quietly or erupt into a defining moment. The choice was about to be made. The pause stretched just long enough to make the air feel heavier, as if even the wind had slowed to watch. The security guards, standing only feet from Marcus, now faced not just one man, but 6 others whose silent presence carried more weight than any badge on their chests. The balance of authority had shifted, and everyone could feel it. In the rows surrounding them, spectators leaned forward, their eyes darting between the guards and the newcomers. The murmurs had transformed into a low hum, like the early rumble of a distant storm. A few parents, sensing the tension, subtly reached for their phones, some to record, others to text updates to friends not present. The atmosphere of celebration had been replaced by a quiet anticipation, a collective awareness that something was unfolding which would be retold long after the caps had been thrown into the air. The taller guard's mirrored sunglasses reflected the seals as he turned his head, gauging them one by one. His hand twitched near the radio on his shoulder, but he hesitated. Something in the way they stood, shoulders squared, feet planted firmly, eyes unblinking, made him reconsider whatever call he was about to make. His partner shifted slightly, a faint flicker of unease crossing his features. The earlier certainty, the authority they had entered with, was eroding under the unspoken weight of the SEAL's solidarity. Marcus, still seated, remained calm. His military training had taught him that power didn't always need to be shown through movement. Sometimes it was in holding your ground, in letting others make the mistake of underestimating you. His heart was steady, his gaze unwavering. This was no longer just about his right to be there. It was about the principle that no one, especially in a moment meant to honor his son, should be disrespected because of assumptions. The music from the band swelled in the background, the bright notes clashing against the quiet tension. The graduates began filing into their seats, some stealing glances toward the commotion, their curiosity visible even from the stage. The principal, finally noticing the crowd's distraction, frowned slightly but continued speaking into the microphone, determined to keep the program moving. One of the SEALs shifted his stance, the movement subtle but deliberate. It wasn't aggressive, just enough to close the space between Marcus and the guards, drawing an invisible line they would have to cross to proceed. The audience seemed to pick up on it, the murmurs now sharper, almost encouraging. It was no longer just Marcus's silent battle, it was becoming a public reckoning. The guards exchanged another glance, their silent conversation written in the tension of their shoulders and the tightening of their jaws. They were at a crossroads, press the issue and risk escalating in front of hundreds, or back down and concede that they had acted prematurely. The taller one's stance faltered for just a moment, a tell Marcus recognized instantly. It was the hesitation of someone who realized they had stepped into territory they didn't fully understand. The SEALs stood motionless, their discipline absolute. Every second they remained was a message, one that said Marcus wasn't alone, and that removing him would not be the simple task the guards had imagined. From the edge of the crowd, a school official began making their way toward the scene, weaving between rows of chairs with a clipboard clutched to their chest. They didn't walk with the stiffness of the guards or the precision of the SEALs. They walked with the urgency of someone who realized an incident was about to overshadow the entire ceremony. The field felt smaller now, the space between each person charged with unspoken challenge. The band's song faded into applause as the first group of graduates sat down. The moment of decision had arrived, balanced precariously on the next move made. The guards straightened, clearly bracing themselves for whatever came next. The SEALs remained still. Marcus didn't shift in his seat. The official drew closer, each step punctuating the building tension. And just as the official reached the edge of their row, the taller guard turned his head sharply toward the SEAL standing closest to him. Whatever words he was about to speak would decide whether this confrontation ended quietly or ignited into something unforgettable. The crowd held its breath. The moment felt suspended, as though the entire ceremony had been put on pause just for this confrontation to play out. The applause for the seated graduates still echoed faintly, but all attention had shifted toward the center of the field, where two security guards stood rigid before Marcus Hill and the 6 men who had wordlessly placed themselves between him and any threat. The taller guard's jaw was tense as he glanced at the nearest SEAL. He had expected a man to flinch under the pressure of authority, but instead, he found himself facing someone whose composure was unshakable. The SEAL's eyes, cool and steady, didn't waver. Behind him, the rest of the team formed an unspoken wall, silent, immovable, and more intimidating in their stillness than any shouted order could have been. The official with the clipboard arrived at the row, stepping into the narrow aisle between the guards and the guests. Their voice was low, urgent, but impossible for the crowd to hear over the ambient noise. The guards leaned in to listen, their faces tightening as the official spoke quickly, pointing once toward Marcus, then toward the front of the field. Around them, the crowd shifted restlessly. Parents exchanged questioning looks, some whispering theories, others pulling out their phones to quietly capture the scene. The optics of what was happening were undeniable. A black man sitting calmly at his son's graduation, surrounded by 6 veterans, while 2 uniformed guards stood as if deciding whether to force him to leave. The principal's voice carried faintly over the speakers, trying to maintain the rhythm of the program, but even they couldn't mask the ripple of attention that refused to fade. Graduates on stage craned their necks, curiosity breaking through their practiced composure. Marcus remained still, his gaze locked on a point just past the guards. He wasn't looking at them directly anymore. His eyes had shifted to the distant stage where his son sat among the other graduates. This day was supposed to be about that boy, the years of sacrifice it had taken to get here, and the pride of a father who had missed birthdays and milestones because duty had called. That was the only reason he had come, and the only thing that mattered. The official gestured again, this time toward the SEALs. The guards glanced back at the 6 men, clearly weighing their options. The taller one's hand twitched toward his radio once more, but the shorter guard subtly shook his head. The SEALs didn't move, didn't speak, didn't need to. Their collective presence was a statement in itself, a reminder that Marcus was not an isolated target, but part of a brotherhood that wouldn't allow his dignity to be stripped away. From somewhere behind them, a faint click of a camera lens was followed by the rapid tapping of fingers on a phone screen. The scene was being documented, and the guards knew it. Every second they hesitated, the risk of this becoming something far larger grew. The taller guard exhaled sharply, the sound almost lost in the crowd's low hum. He stepped back half a pace, a movement so slight it might have gone unnoticed had it not been mirrored, a beat later, by his partner. It wasn't a retreat, not yet, but it was the first sign that they were no longer in full control. The officials, sensing the shift, stepped in more firmly, placing themselves slightly in front of Marcus. Their presence wasn't protective in the same way as the SEALs, but it was enough to redirect the energy away from confrontation and toward resolution. They gestured toward the empty seats further down the row, speaking rapidly to the guards in a way that suggested a compromise was being offered. The SEALs remained in place, watching, not aggressive, not intervening, but making it unmistakably clear that any attempt to remove Marcus by force would be met with immediate, unified opposition. The taller guard straightened, looking at Marcus for a long moment before finally shifting his weight away. His partner followed suit, though his expression was tight, as though swallowing a decision he didn't fully agree with. Without a word, they turned and began walking toward the edge of the field, their steps heavier now, each one echoing their reluctant withdrawal. The audience's reaction was subtle but unmistakable. Shoulders relaxed, murmurs softened, and a sense of quiet satisfaction rippled through the rows. The SEALs didn't move until the guards were fully gone from sight. Only then did they ease their stance, their formation loosening but never truly breaking. Marcus remained seated, his gaze returning to the stage. The official leaned down, speaking briefly to him before stepping away to resume their duties. Whatever was said wasn't for the crowd to know, but it left Marcus with a steady, almost imperceptible nod. The tension didn't vanish entirely. It lingered in the air like the faint echo of a storm that had passed, but the ceremony continued. The principal called the next group of names, the audience clapped, and life inched back toward normalcy. Still, for those who had witnessed it, the moment was etched in memory. The image of one man quietly holding his ground and 6 others standing without hesitation to protect him was not something that would fade easily. Yet, even as the field settled into its rhythm, Marcus knew this wasn't over. The public nature of what had happened meant it would ripple beyond these grounds, drawing questions, judgments, and perhaps even consequences for those involved. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he understood that before the day was over, the quiet unity shown here might be tested in ways he hadn't yet imagined. The applause for the next graduate was still echoing when the security guards disappeared into the periphery of the field, swallowed by the crowd's shifting focus. But the incident hadn't gone unnoticed, and its imprint remained heavy in the air. People were still glancing toward Marcus's section, eyes darting from him to the 6 men seated nearby, as if trying to piece together the quiet force they had just witnessed. Parents whispered behind program booklets. A teenager in the row ahead subtly angled her phone over her shoulder, snapping a discreet photo of Marcus and the SEALs. In another corner, an older couple leaned together, speaking in low tones, their expressions caught somewhere between curiosity and admiration. The SEALs had settled into their seats, but their positioning was deliberate. 3 on either side of Marcus, a human shield without the appearance of one. To the casual observer, it looked like a group of friends sitting together for a joyous occasion. But for those who had seen what happened moments earlier, it was clear that every movement, every glance was still sharp, calculated, and protective. The principal's voice droned on, reading names with practiced cadence. Each graduate stepped across the stage, received their diploma, and returned to their seat. On the surface, the ceremony was proceeding as planned, but underneath, a current of conversation and speculation flowed unchecked. A woman 2 rows back leaned toward her husband, her voice barely above a whisper, remarking on how quickly the guards had backed down. A man further to the left was already typing furiously on his phone, the glow from the screen lighting his face as he relayed the scene to someone not present. Across the aisle, a father adjusted his camera to frame both the stage and the cluster of men in the middle section, capturing them as part of his footage. The school staff on the sidelines were visibly more alert now. A few glanced frequently toward Marcus's section, their expressions tight, as though uncertain whether the issue was resolved or simply paused. The official who had intervened earlier kept moving between duties, but every so often, their eyes flicked toward the center of the field, checking the equilibrium that had been so tenuously restored. Marcus sat with his hands folded over his leather-bound notebook, his gaze fixed firmly on the stage. He didn't acknowledge the attention around him. His focus was on the moment his son would walk forward, an image he had carried with him through countless deployments and nights away from home. No amount of unwanted confrontation would steal that from him. Beside him, one of the SEALs shifted slightly, scanning the crowd. It was a subtle movement, but it betrayed an instinct that never truly left men who had lived their lives in environments where vigilance was survival. Their eyes weren't just on the stage. They were everywhere at once, reading posture, noting movement, cataloging faces. The air was warmer now, the late morning sun pressing down on the rows of guests. A few parents fanned themselves with programs, others took sips from bottled water, but the murmurs about what happened earlier kept weaving through the background noise. Each retelling was slightly different, shaped by the perspective of the person sharing it. In some versions, Marcus had been targeted for no reason. In others, the SEALs had appeared like a prearranged rescue team. In all of them, the security guards had left looking uncertain. Halfway through the ceremony, the rhythm of the program briefly faltered when a technical glitch silenced the microphone. The momentary pause gave space for the buzz of side conversations to swell. Somewhere behind Marcus, a man remarked to his wife that he hoped the incident wouldn't make the local news. In front of him, a teenage boy whispered that it was already on social media. The SEALs didn't react to the chatter, but Marcus could feel the shift. The incident wasn't fading. It was growing legs, moving beyond the ceremony. He knew that once something entered the court of public opinion, it could be twisted, amplified, or weaponized in ways that no one could predict. When the sound system clicked back to life and the principal resumed, the graduates continued their march across the stage. The moment Marcus had been waiting for inched closer with each name called. His heart rate was steady, but a part of him remained alert, aware that the guards hadn't returned but could be watching from a distance. And then, as his son's row stood to line up, Marcus straightened in his seat. The SEALs subtly adjusted as well, their attention temporarily shifting from the crowd to the stage. It was a proud moment, a culmination of years of effort, sacrifice, and guidance. But in the far corner of the field, near the edge of the parking lot, two figures in security uniforms were talking to a man in a dark suit. The man's gaze occasionally drifted toward Marcus's section, his expression unreadable. It wasn't a random glance. It was the kind of measured observation that signaled intention. Marcus didn't notice him yet. The crowd didn't either, but the SEALs did. The ceremony wasn't the only thing unfolding that morning. Something else was quietly taking shape, and when the graduates tossed their caps into the air, it would still be waiting. The principal called Marcus's son's name with deliberate clarity, the microphone carrying it across the field. The boy strode forward, shoulders squared, wearing the same determination that Marcus had carried in uniform for years. Cameras clicked, parents cheered, and tassels swayed in the warm air. From his seat, Marcus felt a deep, quiet pride swell inside him. His son was crossing not just a stage, but a threshold into a future that Marcus had fought to make possible. Every deployment, every sleepless night, every moment of absence, it all crystallized here, in this image of a young man stepping forward to claim his diploma. The SEALs watched silently, but with the same unspoken respect. They understood milestones like this, the moments you held on to during the hardest days, the images you replayed in your mind when the world around you was chaos. As his son shook hands with the principal, Marcus caught the faintest smile break across the young man's face. The crowd's applause swelled, and for a moment, the earlier confrontation seemed to dissolve in the warmth of that shared celebration. But the man in the dark suit had begun moving. He wove through the crowd at the edge of the field, his path measured but direct, eyes never leaving Marcus's section. The security guards trailed a few paces behind him, their postures more rigid now, their earlier hesitation replaced with something else, determination, or perhaps orders. The seal nearest the aisle noticed first. His chin lifted slightly, a signal to the others. The shift was subtle, invisible to the untrained eye, but the entire group reoriented in silent unison. They weren't preparing for confrontation yet, but they were positioning for it. The man in the suit reached the edge of Marcus's row just as his son returned to his seat, diploma in hand. He paused there, waiting for a gap in the applause, and then stepped in. Whatever he said was low, meant only for Marcus's ears. But the tone, the body language, the faint narrowing of his eyes, it carried the same authority as a written order. Marcus didn't rise. He sat with the same steady posture he had held all morning, meeting the man's gaze without a hint of flinch. The seals shifted subtly, enough to close the physical space between Marcus and the newcomer. The man in the suit's expression didn't change. He gave a small nod, as though confirming something to himself, then turned sharply and began walking away. The guards followed. It wasn't until they had disappeared into the crowd again that the seals eased their stance. Marcus remained motionless for a long moment before finally exhaling, his gaze drifting back to the stage. The last graduates crossed, the final speech was made, and the principal declared the class dismissed. Caps flew into the air, cheers erupted, and the field erupted into a swirl of color and motion. Parents rushed forward for photos, students embraced, and the structured formality of the ceremony dissolved into joyous chaos. Even in the middle of the celebration, Marcus felt the presence of watchful eyes. The man in the suit had been too deliberate, too intentional, to simply be a school administrator checking on a disturbance. This wasn't over, but the seals didn't leave his side. They moved with him as the crowd surged toward the field, a casual escort disguised as companionship. Their formation never looked forced, just a group of men sharing a moment of pride, but every step, every glance was calculated. Marcus's son found him quickly, the joy in his face undimmed by whatever had happened earlier. Marcus embraced him, holding on just long enough to etch the moment into memory. Around them, cameras flashed, parents called to their children, and the air was filled with the sound of futures being celebrated. They posed for a few photos together, the seals hanging back just enough to give the family space. Still, they kept the periphery clear, their presence a quiet deterrent to any further interference. When the crowd began thinning, Marcus noticed the man in the suit again, this time standing near the parking lot, talking into a phone. He didn't approach, he didn't need to. The look on his face made it clear that whatever report he was making, Marcus was at the center of it. The seals saw him too. One of them stepped slightly closer to Marcus, speaking quietly enough that no one else could hear. Marcus gave a small nod, and together they began moving toward the cars. They reached the lot without incident, but the man in the suit's gaze followed them the entire way. Marcus could feel it on his back, like a weight he couldn't shake. As they reached his vehicle, the seals didn't say goodbye in the traditional sense. They simply made sure he and his son were safely inside, then dispersed into the flow of departing families, their roles in this chapter of Marcus's life complete. Marcus sat in the driver's seat for a moment, watching the school grounds shrink in the rear-view mirror as he pulled away. The pride of the day was intact, but the edge of unease remained. He knew the story wasn't finished, not in the way viral moments tend to live on long after the event itself. There would be photos, videos, and speculation. People would debate what had really happened, argue over details, and assign motives to strangers they had never met. But Marcus also knew this. On the day someone tried to take away his place at his son's graduation, 6 men had stood without hesitation to ensure he stayed. And that, more than anything else, was what he would remember. The rest, rumors, speculation, the man in the suit, could wait. For now, the only thing that mattered was the quiet ride home, the folded diploma in his son's hands, and the knowledge that some bonds once forged never break. And somewhere in that parking lot, the man in the suit watched the car disappear, already planning whatever came next. The story might have ended here for the ceremony, but the ripple it created was only just beginning.
If you liked this story, please like, subscribe, and share it with others so they can learn something from it too.